Good evening. My great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. As you know, the McCulloch Center works with faculty, students, and offices across the campus to advance global education and to promote cross-disciplinary engagement with the challenges of globalization. One way in which we do that is by hosting a global scholar every fall. A practitioner scholar with a focus on a particular theme, and we embed him or her intellectually into the college life for a week. The focus this year is on the rise of Asia and how the rise of China and India in particular have important, dramatic even implications for the global architecture of economic and political power. I cannot think of a better scholar to address this topic than Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore. Professor Mahbubani is currently the Dean and Professor in the Practice of Public Policy at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the University of Singapore. He spent many years before that in the Foreign Service of Singapore in many different illustrious assignments. He served twice as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations. As one of Asia's leading public intellectuals, he is publishing prolifically and writing not just books like the one you see over here, but numerous columns of ed pieces, articles, book chapters on television. He's being interviewed and he really speaks around the globe. In 2009, the Financial Times included him in a list of the 50 individuals in the world who would shape the debate about the future of global capitalism. We're very fortunate, I'm deeply honored to welcome Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Please help me welcome him.
Thank you, Eva, for the very generous introduction. I'm very glad to be here. And I'm astonished to see so many people come out on such a rainy day. Eva assured me the hall will be empty. As you know, when you start a speech, the hardest part is deciding how to start. In America, you begin with a joke. In Asia, you begin with an apology. So I tell you what, I combine the two traditions, and I'll apologize for my bad joke. But my bad joke actually is a true story. Many years ago, when I was the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, one of my colleagues in another ministry, a permanent secretary, went to China, and when he arrived in China, he called on his counterpart there, the vice minister in China. So when he arrived at the vice minister's office, he introduced himself and he said, "I'm Mr. Tan, and I'm the permanent secretary of this ministry in Singapore." And there was a young Chinese lady translator there. So she looked at him, she was very puzzled. She sort of scratched her head for a while, and then she finally said in Chinese, she said, "This guy says he's Mr. Tan, and he says that he's the eternal typist from Singapore." So permanent secretary became eternal typist. Now the reason I begin with that story is that if you can have cultural misunderstanding between Singapore, which is 75% Chinese, and China, which is 100% Chinese, you realize that we have a challenge in our hands. And that challenge is going to become even greater because we are entering a completely new era of world history. And so the question I'm going to address tonight is the West ready for this new era of world history? And I propose to answer that question in three parts by answering three separate questions. The first question is, will there be an Asian century? And I want to address that question because I can see in the subtext of all the articles that I read in the West, there's still a longing among some Western writers to believe that this is just a temporary bad dream and the Asian century will not happen, that the West will carry on being dominant. So it's important to address the question whether or not there will be an Asian century. Then I will answer the question, how is the West reacting to it so far? And then finally, I answer the important question, I think Lenin first asked it, what is to be done? So this will be a three-part presentation to you. First part, question, will there be an Asian century? My answer is a somewhat surprising one. My answer is that there will not be an Asian century. There will be an Asian millennium. And I say this because if you look back over the last 2,000 years, from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1,800 of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies in the world have been consistently China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and then North America took off. But if you view the last 200 years against the past 2,000 years, the last 200 years have been a major historical aberration. And all historical aberrations come to a natural end. And that's why Goldman Sachs has projected that by 2050, or probably even earlier, the number one economy in the world will be China, the number two economy in the world will be India, the number three economy in the world will be the United States of America, and not a single European economy will be among the top 5 or 6 economies in the world. And this, as you can see, is a complete reversal of what has happened in the past. And so you see the end of Western domination of world history, but I always hasten to add that the end of Western domination of world history is not the end of the West. The West remains strong, probably even the strongest civilization. And I hope, by the way, and I want to emphasize this, I hope that the West will continue to remain a strong civilization and not be weakened. But it will no longer be able to dominate the world, and you will see also the return of Asia, and I call it the return of Asia rather than the rise of Asia, because of the pattern of the last 2,000 years. But I also want to address the question, why is it happening now? Why did it happen 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Why not? So my answer to the question, why it is happening now, is that the reason why it's happening now is because the Asians have finally understood, absorbed, and are implementing what I call 7 pillars of Western wisdom. And I want to speak a little bit about the 7 pillars of Western wisdom to reinforce the point that what is happening, the changes that are happening, are very real. Now, I normally give a 1-hour lecture on the 7 pillars of Western wisdom. I'll try and get it down to 10 minutes and rush through them. Now, what's the first pillar of Western wisdom? The most obvious one, of course, is free market economics. And if you want to understand the power of free market economics, you can see, you have a perfect laboratory example if you look at China's experience in the last 60 years. From 1949 to 1979, for 30 years, China tried centrally planned economics. And it went nowhere. And then when Deng Xiaoping turned things around 78, 79, China tried free market economics, and China delivered the world's fastest growing economy in the world. But today, in one of the most amazing reversals that is taking place in the world of ours today, while faith in free market economics is rising in Asia, faith in free market economics is diminishing in America and Europe. And today, as you know, no politician in America dares to speak in favor of free trade, right? Even President Obama, when he speaks of trade, he speaks of exports. Exports are good, imports are bad. But you don't have trade if you only have exports and no imports, right? So, and by contrast, by the way, you saw that last week the United States Congress passed a bill, passed the free trade agreements with Korea, Panama, and Colombia, finally after many years. While the United States is struggling to pass 3 free trade bills, East Asia has signed over 300 free trade bills. And that shows how free market economics is growing in Asia. And it will further accelerate the shift of power to Asia. Then the second pillar of Western wisdom is mastery of science and technology. This was, you know, this was the reason why the West was able to conquer and dominate the world, because it had superior science and technology. A small country like Portugal could go out and colonize the whole world, colonize Latin America, you have Brazil, colonize Africa, you have Angola and Mozambique, and take a bite of India in Goa, and take a bite of China in Macau. How did a small state of 4 million people do that? Superior science and technology. And today, in one of those amazing shifts again, the mastery of science and technology is shifting to Asia. You know, even the year 2008, 3 years ago, East Asia was already investing more in science and technology than North America or Europe. 384 billion in East Asia, 380 billion in North America, 250 billion in Europe. And that was 3 years ago. And since then, you've had the massive financial crisis. Budgets are being cut in America, budgets are being cut in Europe, and budgets are increasing in East Asia. So again, power will shift faster to East Asia. The third pillar of Western wisdom I describe as pragmatism. Pragmatism is very much a Western virtue, but it is being practiced more and more in Asia. And indeed, the best definition of pragmatism was given by the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, when he said, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or a cat is white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat. Right? And with that simple explanation, he said, it doesn't matter whether it's communism or capitalism, whatever works, we'll use it. And that's how China switched to capitalism. And here again, paradoxically, even though pragmatism was very much a Western virtue, is being practiced more and more in Asia and less in the West. And if you want to know, for example, why you had a major financial crisis in the West 2-3 years ago, that was because Alan Greenspan, the head of the Fed, was trapped by the ideological mindset that said that markets know best, that the regulators, that the traders are smarter than the regulators. Why should regulators regulate the traders who are smarter than them, right? So he allowed an ideological conviction to overcome him, and he forgot to do his job of regulating the markets, and you had a huge financial crisis. By contrast, in Asia, you will find we never had this ideological belief. In Asia, you always had this view that you need both the invisible hand of free markets and the visible hand of good governance to balance each other. And that's why you notice that most Asian countries sailed through the financial crisis much better than the Western countries did 2-3 years ago. The fourth pillar of Western wisdom I would describe as culture, meritocracy. And meritocracy, of course, is again the Western virtue. In fact, one of the primary reasons why the West succeeded is because it was able to introduce meritocracy into its societies to overcome the bad habits of feudalism. And the reason why America has the greatest universities in the world is because you admit students on the basis of merit. and not on the basis of connections. But the reason why Asians are doing well now is that Asians are also beginning to absorb this principle of meritocracy. And you can see the difference it makes. Say, take a country like India, which has had the caste system for over 1,000 years, right? And in India, for a long time, your birth was your destiny. If you were born an untouchable, you lived as an untouchable, and you died as an untouchable. You could never escape the destiny of your birth. But in my book, here, I tell the story of a young Indian boy, born an untouchable, but because of reforms, he goes to school. But when he goes to school, he has to sit in a corner because he's untouchable. He has to eat his meals in a corner because he's untouchable. But he works hard, does well in his exams, gets scholarships, goes to university, does well, gets a scholarship, goes to Columbia University, gets a PhD in economics, and ends up as the chief economist of the Reserve Bank of India. And if you want to know the simplest explanation of why Asia will do well, is actually quite simple. Asia always had the world's largest pool of brains, but it also had the world's largest pool of unused brains. These unused brains are now being used by the millions and by the hundreds of millions. And then you can see clearly the Asian century and the Asian millennium will come. I'm not going to go into the other three pillars of Western wisdom because I was told by the bookseller you're going to buy the book, so you're going to read the remaining three pillars in the book. But I can tell you, by the way, that it is not just each of these pillars that have made a difference. The combination of these 7 pillars have now led to something that is quite amazing that is happening in Asia, and you can't see it because it's completely invisible. And what is this major invisible shift in Asia? I call it the explosion of cultural confidence. And today, if you want to meet the most optimistic young people, please don't go to Europe. You'll find a lot of depression in Europe. If you want to meet the most optimistic young people, go to Asia, because they believe that tomorrow belongs to them. And when the young people begin to believe that tomorrow belongs to them, the pace of change will happen even faster in the shift towards Asia. So I can assure you that there will not just be an Asian century, but there will be another Asian millennium coming to repeat the pattern of the last 2,000 years. And all this, of course, leads me to my second question. How is the West reacting to this? Is it celebrating? Is it happy? Is it delighted? Or is it scared? Is it frightened? Is it worried? I guess you know the answer better than I do, right? And clearly, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that the West is deeply torn in its reaction to the re-emergence of Asia. And it is torn on the one hand between its values, and Western values are wonderful. Because Western values celebrate success, celebrate equality of human beings, celebrate, excellence, and you want to see, in many ways, the success of other societies. So that's why your values drive you. But there's also been an equally powerful impulse in the West to retain control of the world, to retain control of what's happening all around the globe. And you find these two contradictory impulses affecting Western policy towards Asia. And let me illustrate this with some examples. In the case of values, let me mention a couple of wonderful gifts by the West to the rest of the world. One of the biggest gifts that the West gave to the rest of the world, and certainly especially to Asia, was the 1945 rules-based order. As you know, the 1945 rules-based order created a level playing field, created a set of rules for countries to grow and emerge peacefully. And that's why Japan and Germany, as you know, emerged as great powers twice in the 20th century. Before 1945, they had to emerge through conquering and to colonizing other countries. But after 1945, they could emerge peacefully. And this 1945 rules-based order is what is basically allowing India and China to also emerge peacefully. And this peaceful emergence is a result of a Western gift to the world and to Asia. A second big gift that the West has given to the world is this whole principle that free trade is good. And as you know, it was the West that established first the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which subsequently became the World Trade Organization. And it was the West that pushed very hard for the success of trading round after trading round, because it believed that open trade would make the world a better place. And it has, you know. The combination of the 1945 rules-based order and the message of free trade has actually created a much better world, because in the last 60 years, we have not seen a repeat of World War I or World War II. And at the same time, the global economy is the biggest it has ever been. Now the global economic growth that we have seen in the past 60 years has been phenomenal. All this again, a result of Western gift to the world as a result of Western values. I can tell you the most important Western gift that has been shared with the rest of the world is what you see in this room, which is education. And believe me, it is quite astonishing that a successful civilization like the West has not tried to keep as a secret, right, the pillars of Western wisdom. In fact, it has shared them with the rest of the world. And even today, as we speak, if you look at this room, you can see the number of students who come from overseas. And I understand that Mount Holyoke is unusually generous. You have 26% of your body who come from overseas. All in all, you have 700,000 foreign students studying in America today. Now that's incredibly generous. You're sharing the best of Western civilization with the rest of the world. This is what I mean about the values of the West leading to a positive reaction to the rise of Asia. And if it's only the values that, if it was only the values that drove how the West would react, you would have a very happy world. And you could go to sleep at night thinking there'll be no more problems. But as you know, there is a conflicting impulse in the West. And that conflicting impulse is the desire to retain control and power. And this is a natural thing, by the way. It happens all the time, throughout history. Countries which are powerful never give up power voluntarily. And you see this happening too, with the West too. You know, if I take, for example, the two areas I mentioned of Western gifts. Take the 1945 rules-based order, which was a major Western gift to humanity. The 1945 rules-based order has worked very well, but there are within it some institutions which have traditionally been controlled by the West. The best examples are, of course, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank. And ever since they've been created, there's been a rule that says the head of the IMF must be a European and the head of the World Bank must be an American. Now that rule may have made sense 50 years ago, 40 years ago, or 30 years ago. But as we move into a world where the fastest growing economies are Asian economies, where the largest pool of foreign reserves are held by Asian economies, and now the world's largest pool of economics PhDs is now in Asia. How can you have a rule that says no Asian is qualified? to run the IMF or the World Bank. Now, in theory, the Western government said, no, we agree with you. In fact, there was a G20 meeting in London a few years ago where they announced very proudly that the future selection of leaders of IMF and the World Bank should be based on merit and will no longer be determined by geography. And I thought, boy, what a breakthrough. Here, Europe and America voluntarily giving away power. And then you saw what happened this year. Right? As you know, Dominic Strauss-Kahn had to leave his office. I will not discuss the reasons why. It's not polite to do so, I guess. But you saw that almost immediately, within a few days of him stepping down, the French government, I thought, would apologize to the rest of the world and say, I'm truly sorry. We seconded a French civil servant who didn't succeed. We apologize for this, and we would like somebody else to take on the job. So I think you all know the word chutzpah, right? It's a wonderful word. The French government with amazing chutzpah said, hey, so what? One Frenchman succeeded, he'll be succeeded now by a French woman. So within 3 days, they put up a candidature, and of course, as you know, a French woman succeeded and took over the IMF again, and nothing changed. I'm sure some of you are asking, so why didn't some Asian candidates run and compete and try to take over the IMF? There would have been no point for them to run and compete because the election system in the IMF is completely rigged. The United States has 17% of the vote, the European Union has 32% of the vote, Australia, Canada, New Zealand another 2 or 3%. You combine all the Western votes, you get a situation where the 12% of the world's population who live in the West control 51% of the vote in IMF. So even if any Asian runs, he is bound to lose, he or she, because the system is rigged. And this is a perfect example of the West's reluctance to give up its power and share it with the new rising powers. You see the same problem happening also in the UN Security Council. As you know, the UN Security Council is the most powerful body in the world because it makes decisions that are mandatory on the rest of humanity. And essentially, even though there are 15 members of the UN Security Council, I can tell you that before Singapore joined the UN Security Council in 2001, a very wise diplomat from Chile said to me, Kishore, you will soon discover that even though in theory the Security Council has 15 members, in practice it has 5 members, the 5 permanent members, and 10 observers. So the 5 permanent members, United States, Russia, UK, France, and China, control it. And it's true, they control it. And what the reason, why are they there? They are there because they won World War II in 1945. They are the most powerful countries in 1945. So it made sense to give them the veto. Then, 66 years have gone by. And these are no longer the 5 most powerful countries in the world. Logically, if you lived in a world where you said, okay, great powers come, great powers go, new great powers to join the UN Security Council, right? But it's not going to happen. And I can tell you this because, you know, the UN set up a group called the Open-Ended Working Group on Security Council Reform in 1993. They've been working for 18 years. Nothing has changed. So my friends say, change the name from Open-Ended Working Group on Security Council Reform to Never-Ending Working Group on Security Council Reform. And that, why is there no change? Because established powers, including the established powers of the United Kingdom and France, which were essentially yesterday's powers, refused to give up their seats in the UN Security Council. So I'm giving you example after example to illustrate how, on the one hand, the values of the West drive the West towards accepting the rise of Asia. On the other hand, the desire to retain power means a reluctance to share power with the emerging powers in Asia. And this tension is going to create a lot of problems for the world. And so this brings me to the last part of my presentation. What is to be done? How do we solve this problem? And I actually believe, and I'm actually an optimist, I actually believe that we can persuade the West to live with and accept the return of Asia. And how would I persuade the West to do this? I think you can make a case that the long-term interests of the West and the long-term interests of Asia are aligned with each other. They're not necessarily misaligned. That a rising Asia should not be seen as a threat by the West, because I can assure you of one thing: the goal of the rising Asia is not to dominate the West, but to replicate the West. If you look at the aspirations of young people in Asia, what do they want to have when they succeed and grow up? What do they want to have? They want to have the same kind of middle-class lifestyles that many in the West have enjoyed for the last 50, 60 years. Same. They have no other dreams and aspirations. They want to work hard, they want to get a good income, they want to provide a good education for their children, they want their children to come to Mount Holyoke and study here, they want their children to do well and have a good career. Same dreams as what you have seen over here. So there's absolutely no reason why the West should be terrified of what the Asians are trying to do. And I can tell you also that we can create a global order which can accommodate the interests of the West and the interests of a rising nation. And I'll give you a couple of examples to illustrate that. I think the time has come, for example, to now create stronger multilateral institutions. The reason why stronger multilateral institutions are important is that they create a level playing field for all countries. Now, in theory, this is what the 1945 rules-based order was supposed to do. But I can tell you, and I'm not giving a big secret away, that it has been American policy to weaken multilateral institutions. And if you want proof of that, it's very simple. Ask yourself, why is it that whenever the United Nations has to select a Secretary General, right? Traditionally, you assume that if you want to see an institution succeed, you should pick the most dynamic, capable person to run the organization. Do you know that it is American policy to ensure that if you're dynamic and capable, you can never become Secretary General of the United Nations? And I'm not giving a big secret away. If you read the memoirs of John Bolton, the former United States ambassador to the UN, he actually puts down in print, he writes down in the book, he says, Condi Rice was then Secretary of State, Condi Rice and I discussed who the next Secretary General of the UN should be. And we both agreed that we do not want anybody strong and effective. It's in print. And that, I think, is a mistake now on the part of the United States to do that. Because the time has come to create stronger multilateral institutions, because stronger multilateral institutions will constrain all great powers. And why is this important? Well, let me quote what Bill Clinton once said. Bill Clinton, after he stepped down from office, and as you know, most leaders become much wiser after they step down from office, gave a speech in 2003 in Yale. And what did he say in the speech? He said, if the United States believes that it will forever be number one in the world, what it should do is say, okay, doesn't matter what the rest of the world thinks, I'll always be number one, I can do whatever I want to do. But if the United States can conceive of the idea or of the possibility that someday it may be number 2 or number 3 in the world, then maybe it's in America's interest to create stronger multilateral institutions that will not just constrain American power, but also constrain the power of any rising powers elsewhere. So you constrain China and India at the same time as it constrains America. And that surely is in the interest of everybody, right? To create a set of rules that constrain great powers from behaving in a unilateral fashion. And we have seen, by the way, that even a country like the United States, which has traditionally been a great believer in the rule of law, and traditionally perceived to be a relatively responsible actor on the world stage, can violate international law and invade a country illegally, as it did in Iraq in 2003. It just ignored global opinion and unfortunately created a bad precedent for other rising powers. Now I hope the United States realizes the wisdom of actually having institutions that will curtail the power not just of the United States, but of other emerging powers. And at the same time, I also believe, parallel to this, it's also in the interest of the United States to apply internationally the same adherence to the rule of law as it applies domestically, right? In domestically, Americans believe fervently in one rule of law for everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're Richard Nixon or Bill Gates, you are subject to the same rule of law within America. If you break the law, you are punished, right? And Dominic Strauss-Kahn also discovered this about American rule of law a few weeks ago. Now, it's important to apply that globally to all the emerging great powers also. And if you can apply that rule of law, that will also constrain all the emerging powers at the same time. And I can tell you that one would think that the emerging powers will not be happy with this, right? Why should they subject themselves to these constraints? And this is where I have good news for all of you. Because China and India and the other Asian countries now have the most to lose if there is an unstable world order, right? They are on the verge of having rapid economic growth. And what can stop this rapid economic growth? Global instability. So it is in the interests of China and India and the rising Asian powers to actually have greater global stability. And that's why if you made a proposal to strengthen multilateral institutions, if you made a proposal to have greater rule of law, they say, great, this is what we need. This is how we'll grow rapidly. So this is why we actually are at a moment of world history which is so plastic and so important. This is the time when we have to make the right decisions to ensure that the next 20, 30 years go off well. And this is why it's very important that all you people in Mount Holyoke join the campaign to have stronger institutions of global governance to ensure that we have a stable world order. Thank you very much.